Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Mitzvah Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Mem Tes Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today 2 lines off the bottom of Kuf Mem Tes Amid Aleph, Siman Shin Chaf Aleph Sif Yud Gimel. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kabeis Yisrael, Hanasunim Batzar Ubashivya, Haim Nebein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha, Hamakim Yerachem Aleihem, V'Yitzia Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelo La'ira Mishubad L'Geula, Hashta Bagolav Zman Kariv and Amar Amen. Our learning should be a schus for Shalema, for Yeshua Levi, Ben Ahuva Malka Chana, by Shabbat Ben Esther Fradel, Yitzchak Ben Tzion, Ben Dusha, Rivka Bas Shiraleh, Chavadasa Bas Serel. They should have Refuah Shalema B'Sar Sharka Yisrael, and B'schus the limud HaTorah of Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shem should watch over every member of Klal Yisrael B'chol Makom Shehem. Okay, so this is turning out to be a quite fascinating siman, the siman Shin Chaf Aleph. The title that the Mechaber chose to give the siman back on Kuf Mem Zayin Amud Aleph was Dinei Toilish B'Shabbos, V'din Toichen, V'dinei Tikunei Meichel, Ma'abed, Valosh, and indeed, we seem to be going from topic to topic to topic here in this siman, and today is no exception. Moving along to Sif Yud Gimel, we now have another interesting digression. Says the Mechaber, Arsel Radois Chalois Dvash Me'akaveres. You are not allowed to remove a honeycomb from a beehive. So Chalois Dvash are honeycombs. A kaveres is a beehive, as the Ramah says in the parentheses. Pirush, what is a kaveres? Hakain, the nest. Shadvoirim oisim by hadvash, where the honeybees produce their honey. So you're not allowed to remove a honeycomb from a beehive. Why not? Continues the Mechaber, mipnei shedoimel l'toilesh, because to uproot and remove the honeycomb from the beehive is similar to the malacha of toilesh, to detach something that is growing from the ground. You're not allowed to go to the ground and take a cucumber off of the vine. You can't go ahead and pluck a tomato or a pepper or an apple. That would be the Issa Daraisa of toilesh, of detaching and uprooting something mimakam gidulai, from where it grows. So too says the Mechaber, to remove a honeycomb from the beehive is doime l'toilish. It's not the Issa Daraisa of toilish, but it is similar to toilish, and therefore there is an Isser Darabanan. Now, just you should understand that the honeycomb is attached to the structure of the beehive. The bees create a hive, and they build the honeycombs, and they attach the honeycombs to the structure of the hive itself. The truth is that if you look into it, you'll see that the structure of a beehive is a very interesting feat of engineering that's done by what seems to be these mindless insects. Not so. The structure of the beehive and the way the honeycombs are constructed and how the honeycombs are attached to the beehive is rather fascinating. There are vertical beams and there are horizontal braces, etc., etc. So the honeycomb is attached to the beehive. The honey is inside the combs of the beehive. The Isser that the Mechaber has told us so far is if you want to go into the beehive or open up the beehive and break off a comb and remove a honeycomb from the beehive, that would be also b'drabanan because of its similarity to the malacha of toilish. Says the Mishnah Berurah, says the Mishnah Berurah, it's also to remove the honeycomb from the beehive. Hainu, afilu lo yirtza livrar hadvash min hashayva. We're not discussing removing the honey from the beeswax. The honeycomb is constructed of wax. If you would look at a honeycomb, so you've got this wax structure with these little hexagonal openings that are filled with honey. We're not talking about extracting the honey from the honeycomb. We're talking about removing the honeycomb from the hive. That's why the Mishnah is telling us, realize The Mechaber is telling you you're not allowed to take the honeycomb out of the hive. That's true even if you're not extracting the honey from the beeswax of the honeycomb. To remove the honey from the honeycomb is a whole different problem. That would come up against the Isser of mefarek, which we discussed at great length. Mefarek is when you extract something from inside its encasement. So it's a toilada of the malacha of dash, where you extract the wheat kernel from the husks. So too, if you were to extract the honey from the honeycomb, you would come up against a problem of mefarek. That's not what we're talking about over here. Over here, we're talking about taking the honeycomb out of the hive. You have to break it off the hive. That's doima to toilish. The Yisod Rabbanon that the Mechaber is addressing is the Yisod Rabbanon to remove the honeycomb from the hive. And Oiskat Mem Zayin, why is that also with the Rabbanon? Shedoima l'toilish, because it is very similar to the malacha of toilish, to detach something that grows from the ground. In what way is it similar? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, Ki makam gidol hadvash hu bakaveres, because the honey, so to speak, grows inside the hive. So we look at the honeycomb containing the honey that's attached to the walls of the hive. We look at it that the hive is the makam gidulai. It's the place that the honeycomb and the honey grows. Therefore, to break it off and extract it, that's similar to toilish. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, V'chashavu chachamim k'mechuber. The chachamim looked at the kaveres, and they decided that it's as if it's mechuber l'karka. It's attached to the hive. To break it off is too similar to toilish, and therefore that would be an Issa d'Rabbanan. Turning back to Kuf Mem Tes Amud Aleph, bottom line, says the Ramah, Hagah. This Isser, that you're not allowed to remove the honeycomb from the hive, v'dafka im devukin bakaveres. That's only true if the honeycomb is still attached to the structure of the kaveres of the hive. Turning to Kuf Mem Tes Amud Beis, aval im nitlishu meba'od yom. However, if the honeycomb, if the chalois dvash, if the honeycomb was broken off of the structure of the kaveres already from Erev Shabbos, so you opened up the hive and you broke a honeycomb off of the structure of the hive, but it is still physically located inside the hive. It's in the hive, but it's detached, and it was detached from Erev Shabbos. That's one case. Or another scenario, shenisrasku miba'od yom. You reached into the hive on Erev Shabbos and you crushed the honeycomb. The honeycomb is still attached to the hive, but you crushed it. What did you accomplish by crushing it? Now that you crushed it, the honey that was contained in the honeycomb has now come out of the honeycomb. So, again, two scenarios the Ramah is giving me here. The Mechaber gave us an Issa d'Rabbanan. You're not allowed to detach and remove a honeycomb from the hive on Shabbos. Now comes the Ramah, and he's giving us two scenarios that are mutter. Scenario number one, what if you reached into the hive and you broke the honeycomb off the structure of the hive on Erev Shabbos? So it's sitting in the hive, but it's already broken off. That was scenario number one. Scenario number two, you left the honeycomb attached to the structure of the hive, but you squeezed it and you crushed it. Now that you squeezed it and you crushed it, the honey is no longer inside the honeycomb. The honey is now on the outside of the honeycomb. You crushed the honeycomb on Erev Shabbos, you left it attached to the hive. V'advash tzaf bakaveres. And now the honey is kind of floating. Tzaf means floating. V'advash tzaf bakaveres. Now the honey is floating inside the hive, but it's no longer in the honeycomb. In that case, says the Mishnah Berurah, mutter l'radoisai b'Shabbos. In either of those cases, it would be mutter. What would be mutter? So in scenario number one, where you broke the honeycomb off the structure of the hive on Erev Shabbos, now to remove the honeycomb from the hive on Shabbos would be mutter. Why? Because it's no longer similar to Tailish. You're not detaching anything. It was already detached before Shabbos. It was still in the hive, but it was already detached. In scenario number 2, where you crushed the honeycomb and you left it attached to the hive, but you're allowed to remove the honey. Why are you allowed to remove the honey? Because there's no Tailish anymore. You're not breaking the honeycomb off the hive. And as far as the honey is no longer in the honeycomb. You crushed the honeycomb, and you already let the honey come out of the honeycomb. So you're not detaching anything, and there's also no mefarek. You're not extracting the honey from the comb, it's already extracted. So in both of those scenarios, says the Ramah, mutter l'radoisai b'Shabbos. In scenario number 1, you would be allowed to remove the comb from the hive on Shabbos. In scenario number 2, you would be allowed to remove the honey on Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah Memches. Im nitlishu. What does that mean? When the Ramah said im nitlishu, if it was detached b'ba'od yom, explains the Chavetz Chaim what the Ramah means. Hainu shahachalois nitlishu mimakom chaburan b'kaveris. You detached the honeycombs from their point of attachment to the hive. Umunachim kach b'soicha. And now the honeycomb is sitting loose inside the hive. It's already detached. Now you could no longer look at the honeycomb as being mechuber. It's not attached. It's not attached to anything. You already broke it off the structure of the hive. Alkein, therefore, now on Shabbos, you could physically remove the honeycomb from the hive. Now, what are you going to do? Okay, we got to follow this. Do the math. You're allowed to remove the honeycomb from the hive. Why? Because it's no longer attached. It was detached from before Shabbos. So there's no doima l'toilish. There's no malachi here of detaching anything. But what are you going to do once you get the honeycomb out? Remember, you can't extract the honey from the honeycomb because that would be mefarek. So what's the point of this operation? You're right. Now there's no Issa D'Rabbanan to remove the honeycomb from the hive, but what are you going to do with it? You can't get to the honey, it's mefarek. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, no, there is something you can do. Al-Kain, therefore, since the honeycomb is already detached from the hive, you could remove the honeycomb from the hive for what purpose? Kedei lechol hadvash, to eat the honey, hadavuk al gabam misaviv. You can eat the honey that's on the surface of the honeycomb. Not all of the honey is contained within the cavities of the honeycomb. There is some honey that oozes out and is on the surface of the honeycomb. Over there's no mefarek. So in this scenario, there's no doima l'toilish, there's no isra d'Rabbanan of doima l'toilish, because it's already detached from the hive from before Erev Shabbos. There's no mefarek, because you're not going to eat the honey that's inside the honeycomb, you're going to eat the honey that's on the exterior of the honeycomb. You would not be allowed now to crush the honeycomb and extract the honey to zeu b'chlal mefarek, because that would be the isser of mefarek. Because it would be similar to removing the kernel of grain from its husks. Even if you get this honeycomb out of the hive, and now over the course of Shabbos, honey oozes out from inside of the honeycomb, but it oozes out on Shabbos, that honey is aser ad la'erev. That honey is aser until Motzei Shabbos. Why? Gzeira shem yirasek biyadayim. Because over here we have gzeira, if we're going to allow you to use the honey that oozes out from the honeycomb on its own on Shabbos, you might come to squeeze the honeycomb on Shabbos. That would be the iser of mefarek. This is very similar to another halacha that we learned earlier when it comes to schita. We learned that if you have grapes and the juice oozes out of the grapes on Shabbos, you're not allowed to use that juice. Why? Because we're afraid if we allow you to use that juice that oozed out on Shabbos, you might come to do schita. You might come to squeeze the grapes on Shabbos, which would be an iser da'araisa. The second scenario of the Ramah was shenisrasku miba'id yom, or if you crushed the honeycomb inside the hive from Erev Shabbos. What does that mean? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. Hainu shariskad lahachalois you crushed the honeycombs, but you left them attached to the structure of the hive. So you reached into the hive, you crushed the honeycomb, and you extracted the honey. But the honeycomb is still attached to the walls of the hive. But now, since you crushed the honeycomb, the honey is coming out. You could remove that honey that is, so to speak, floating loose inside the hive. Because it's not attached to the kaveres, so there's no doima le-tolush over here. But are you allowed to remove the honeycomb? No, you can't remove the honeycomb. Because the honeycomb itself is still attached to the hive. So to take it out, that would be doima le-tolush. That would be the mechaber's original iser d'Rabbanan. Okay, so that concludes our discussion of beehives. Now we move on to a discussion that I believe is going to take up the next 2 seifim. No, maybe a little bit more. Yeah, it does take more than 2 seifim. And now we're going to embark on a discussion of the malacha of lush. What is the malacha of lush? Lush is one of the lamites malachas. Lush is kneading. So kneading with a K. Kneading. The classic example of lush is you take flour, you add liquid, and now you knead it, right? You knead it together, and you form a dough. That is lush 101. That is one of the lamites malachas d'oraisa that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. Now, we're going to begin Sif Yodalid by looking at Mishnah Berurah Ois Kat Nun, where the Mishnah Berurah is going to give us a little bit of a primer on the malacha of lush. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ein megablin. You're not allowed to knead. Megablin, gibel, is kneading. Okay. Hine, says the Chavetz Chaim. Before I embark on explaining the words of the Shulchan Aruch here in Sif Yodalit, says the Chavetz Chaim, Neva'er ktsas inyan lisha. First, I'm going to spend a little time explaining to you the topic of lisha, the topic of this malacha of kneading. Says the Mishnah Berurah, like I said, lisha hi achas milamites avos malachos. The malacha of lush is one of the lamites malachas. Ve'inenu dafka yidei mayim. And the malacha of lush does not have to involve water. Like I said, the classic lush 101 is flour, and the liquid component is water. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you could do lush using a different medium. It doesn't have to be water. Tehuadin bidvash, you could use honey, and you could, to knead something with honey, could also be the av malacha of lush. Vishuman avaz, or the schmaltz, the fat of a goose, or oil. There's a lot of liquids that you could use to knead something and produce a batter or a dough, and you would come up against the Yisr of lush. V'chol minei mashke shenilosh v'nidbak al yodam. Any type of liquid that you're going to incorporate into small solid pieces or grains, and you're going to use that medium, you're going to use the liquid component in order to take the dry component and knead it into one unified mass, you're always going to come up against the Isser of lush. Now, hine, b'inyan lisha, when it comes to the topic of the malacha of lush, Tanya b'braisa b'gemara, we have a braisa in Masechta Shabbos on Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph, De'emechad noisid kemach. Let's say you have 2 people. One comes with dry flour. So, Ruvain takes a few scoopfuls of dry flour and he pours them into a bowl. Has he done anything? Has he come up against any Isurei Shabbos? Not really. He took flour and he put it into a bowl. Okay. Ve'echad noisid mayim. And now a second individual comes and he pours water into the flour. Says the Braisa, Ha'achrein chayiv divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says that the second individual The one who poured the water into the flour is chayiv. If he did this b'shoigeg, he is chayiv to bring a korban chatos. That means that Rebbe says the simple act of pouring the liquid into the solid, that already is the Issa Daraisa of lush. Now that's not typically how you think of lush. You typically think of lush, I'm a matzah baking person, so I'm picturing in my mind the kneter, which means the kneader in Yiddish, right? What happens? You have one person who pours the kemach into the bowl, the flour into the bowl. A second individual pours the water into the bowl. And then the kneter, the kneader, the one who kneads it into a dough, he puts his hands in and he plays KitchenAid. He's the one who goes in there and he kneads the dough. So when you think of the Issa Daraisa of Lisha, most people think, did the guy who put the kemach in the bowl do anything? Did he do lush? No, he didn't do lush. Did the second fellow who poured the water into the kemach, did he do lush? We would normally say, no, he didn't do lush either. Who did lush? The third guy, the kneter, the KitchenAid. He's the one who did lush. He kneaded the water and the flour together to form a dough. Turns out that this is a major machlokes tanoim in a brayso Masechta Shabbos and Yud Ches and Aleph. That's what the Mishnah Berurah is telling us here. Hine be'inyan lisha, when it comes to the topic of the malacha of lisha, Tanya bebrayso begemara. We have a brayso daf Yud Ches and Aleph in Shabbos. Dim echad noisin kemach. If Ruvain puts the flour in the bowl, ve'echad noisin mayim, and Shimon pours the water into the dry flour, ha'achron Shimon chayiv. Rebbe says he's chayiv, divrei Rebbe. He was just over the Issa Daraisa of lush. Now, why would that be? The reason is because when you pour the water into the flour, you have just begun the act of lisha. As soon as you pour water into flour, a certain amount of water is going to come into contact with a certain amount of flour. It is going to hydrate the flour, and as soon as that water hydrates the flour, the chemical process which works to convert flour and water into dough is going to begin. You should just understand that the creation of dough is not only the result of a mechanical mixing and combining of tiny grains of flour with liquid. There's a whole chemical process that goes on. When you hydrate flour, you release proteins, you release enzymes, you create gluten. All of this acts to form a dough, even without the mechanical process of Mr. KitchenAid actually going ahead and mixing the flour together with the water. So Rebbe looks at the person who adds the flour and says, you know what? He already did lush. He already hydrated the flour. He already did lush. That's divrei Rebbe. For Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda is more makel. Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda says no. Einoi chayiv. There's no Issa Daraisa ad sheyagabel. Rabbi Yossi ben Yehuda says no. The one who pours in the water is not over an Issa Daraisa. The Issa Daraisa of lisha is the way we typically think of lisha. It's the one who mechanically mixes the flour with the water. That's the Issa Daraisa. According to most people, even Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda would be maskim that pouring the water in is an Issa Darabanan. But it's not an Issa Daraisa. Upasku Raiva Paiskim, says the Mishnah Berurah, most Paiskim paskin, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. They make like Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. They say Issa Daraisa only when you actually perform the act of kneading. Pouring the water in is not enough to be over an Issa Daraisa. However, das Baal HaTruma, it's the opinion of the Truma Sadeshen, Visiatoi, and other Rishonim, and if you look at the Sharit Zion, you have Rebbe Elazar Mimitz, the Smag, the Smak, the Agos Maimonis. So we're not talking, Adas Yechidah, we're not talking about one single solitary opinion, we're not talking about, relatively obscure shittas, talking about a Smag, a Smak, Rebbe Elazar Mimitz, Hagos Maimonis, serious Rishonim over here. So Lifsai Kerebi. There are those Rishonim that taka paskid l'chumra like Rebbe, and they hold that just pouring the water in is already an Issa Daraisa of lush. Da yedei nesinas mayim nikra gibel. Once you add water, that is called gibel. That is called losh daraisa. Okay, so what do we have here so far? So far, the Mishnah Berurah told us you should understand losh. It's one of the lamites malachas. Do you have to use water in order to be over the Isser Daraisa of losh? No, it could be any mashke that performs the same. It creates the same result as water. That it creates the mixture that you get by kneading. He brings down honey, schmaltz, any other type of liquid that does this. That could also be lush. Then he gives us this machlokes in the Brisa and the Gemara. What exactly constitutes lush? Is merely adding the water lush, or do you have to actually do the mechanics of mixing it? We have a machlokes tanoim. Rebbe says simply adding the water. That's already lush. Reb Elazar, or Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda says no. In order to be over this daraisa, you have to actually mix. Who do we paskin like? Major machlokes rishonim. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. The holds all of this whole discussion that we've had is only germane, says the Mishnah Berurah, bekemach, when we're dealing with flour, oy afar, or we're dealing with dirt, v'tet, we're dealing with mud, v'choil hadak, we're dealing with fine sand, like the sand you have on the beach, tehu bar gibel. These are substances that you can knead. You can combine them with liquid, and you could create one unified mass that is similar to a dough. You go to the beach and you add water into the fine sand on the beach, you could create a unified mass which is very similar to dough. These are substances that we call bar gibel. These are things that are subject to the malacha of lush. They're things that can be kneaded into one unified mass. Other items fall into this category as well. Aval b'davar duhu lav bar gibel. But how about if you're dealing with a substance that does not really blend, mix, get kneaded into one unified mass? Kigoin afer, like ash, says the Mishnah Berurah. Now, I never tried to knead ash into a mass. I don't know, but the Mishnah Berurah says it's not a bar gibel. V'choil hagas, or very coarse sand. Now, when it comes to items that are called bar gibel and items that are called not bar gibel, the Mefarshim have different ways of explaining what the bar is. But high level, the bar seems to be that there are substances like flour or like very fine sand that when you introduce liquid and you combine them using the medium of a liquid, they taka form one unified mushy mass like a dough. Then you have other items like coarse sand that they will loosely combine by the addition of liquid, but that's only because when you add the liquid to these particles, the particles soften up, they become sticky, and now everything kind of holds together. But what happens when it dries up? When it dries up, it falls apart again. The particles don't really stick together. Dough, once you mix flour and water, you have this whole chemical process I was telling you about before. But once you mix flour with water, it's not coming apart again. Even if it dries up, leave it out in the sun, it's not going to become flour again. That ain't happening. It changes structurally. It becomes a dough. Cement. Cement is largely different types of sand that contain silica, etc., and water. And cement, right, it doesn't dry up and then just crumble back into the original particles, right? It remains a new type of substance. It needs into a new substance, into one unified mass. So those are examples of things that are bar gibel. The things that are not bar gibel are things that do not truly combine. So now, what's the halacha when you're dealing with something that's not a bar gibel? What is the status of the Isser of lush when you add liquid to substances that are not truly bar gibel? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Aval b'davar du lav bar gibel, by things that don't really combine. Kigoin afer, ash, v'chol gas, coarse sand. Here we have a machlokes rishonim. That's a Rambam v'siyato. It's the opinion of the Rambam and those other rishonim who agree with him. Da'afim gibloi. If you go ahead and you need something that is not truly a bar gibel, potam echatos. There's no issa daraisa. So the Rambam holds that there's only an issa daraisa of lush when you're dealing with a substance that's a true bar gibel. But if it's not a true bar gibel, there's no issa daraisa. There's only an issa darabanan. There is. For raki surika, there's an issa darabanan because it's similar to gibel, but it's not true lush, and there's no issa daraisa. Vedas harbe rishonim, but it's the opinion of many other rishonim. The Sharatzion brings down Tosfos Shabbos, the Rosh, the Ravid, the Rashba, the Ran, well-known names, right? There's a lot of other rishonim that say lehepich. There are rishonim that say punkt fakert. There are rishonim that say mamish the opposite. What do I mean the opposite? Well, according to the Rambam, something that's not a bar gibel is much more lenient than something that is a true bar gibel. Kemach is a true bar gibel. You go ahead and you do lush with kemach, it's a daraisa. Choil hagas, coarse sand, not a bar gibel. Says the Rambam, much more mekel. If it's not a bar gibel, you can't be over an issa daraisa. It would only be an issa darabanan. Now come along in some rishonim and they say, you know what? Something that's not a bar gibel is actually more chamor. It's more stringent than something that is a bar gibel. Sounds counterintuitive, right? So let's see the explanation. Says the Mishnah Berurah, "V'das harbe rishonim lehepech, de bedavar de lav bar gibel." These rishonim say by substances that are not a bar gibel, af l'Rebbe Yossi ben Rebbe Yehuda. Even according to Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda from the brisa that we learned about earlier, who says that by a bar gibel, you're only over the issa daraisa when you actually mechanically mix it, not like Rebbe, who said that you're over the issa daraisa as soon as you add the water. These rishonim say that something that's a lav bar gibel, even Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, who said that in order to be over this daraisa, you actually have to mechanically do the mixing, says these rishonim, loy boy gibel. These rishonim say that by something that's a lav bar gibel, even Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda would admit that you could be over an issa daraisa just by adding the water. You don't actually have to do gibel. Umishanasid by mayim, once you add water, chayiv. You're chayiv v'chatos if you did it b'shoigig. So this is daraisa. Why? Dezehu gibuloi. Because what these rishonim say is, when you're dealing with kemach, flour, that's a bar gibel, it truly does form a dough. That's when Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda says, in order to be over this daraisa of lush, you actually have to mix it and make a dough. But by something that's a lav bar gibel, you don't accomplish anything by actually mixing it. Whatever you're going to accomplish, you already accomplished by simply adding the water. Going in and mixing it is not going to accomplish anything more because it's lav bar gibel. Therefore, these rishonim say, by a lav bar gibel, you're over an issa daraisa as soon as you add the water. Counterintuitive, but there you go. Says the Mishnah Berurah, va'ata. And now, against this backdrop, bearing in mind all the information that I just gave you in this hakdama, novoi leva'er divrei HaShulchan Aruch. Now we could explain the words of the Shulchan Aruch in the coming seif. Okay, so now let's start Sif Yodalid, bearing in mind what we just learned in Mishnah Berurah's Katan Nun, so that we could do the math in the cases that the Mechaber is going to give us. Now, the Mechaber is going to start off over here in Sif Yodalid, discussing the halacha of something that is not a bar gibel, which is interesting, right? Because you would have thought that the Mechaber would go mikal el hakaved. He would go from more simple to more complex. So let's start with Lush 101, mixing Kemach with water. Bar Gibel, that's Mamish Lush Daraisa, boom, boom, boom. Yet, the Mechaber B'Chachmasai did not do it that way. The Mechaber is going to start off giving us the halacha of something that's not a true Bar Gibel. What is that case? The Mechaber is going to discuss what he calls Kemach Koli, flour that is produced from toasted grain. That's what Koli is. Koli is toasted grains. Now, apparently, I never tried this, I never saw it, but apparently, when you toast grain and then you produce flour from toasted grain, it no longer has the necessary properties to really go ahead and form a dough. When you introduce liquid, it will combine to some extent, but this is the type of item that's lav bar gibel. It doesn't form a true dough. It doesn't really combine into one true unified mass. So that's the case that we're discussing here. Says the Mechaber, Ein megablin. You're not allowed to knead. You're not allowed to do lush. Right away jumps in the Ramah. And the funny thing about this Ramah is that the Mishnah Berurah tells us, don't take the Ramah so 100% seriously. Meaning, I don't mean don't take him seriously. I mean, don't be too medayik. In the words of the Ramah, there's a diuk here that you would be tempted to make in the Ramah. Don't make that diuk. Because this Ramah, lav dafka. So the Mechaber said, Ein megablin. You're not allowed to perform lush. Jumps in the Ramah. What does megablin mean? Says the Ramah, Pirush, Nesinas mayim bekemach, introducing water into flour, nikra gibel. That's what's called lush. Now, if you wanted to be medayik in this Ramah, the diuk that you would make is you would jump in and you would say, oh, the Ramah is taking sides, but in the Machlokes Rebbe and Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda that we just learned about Mishnah Berurah's Kadnun. The Mishnah Berurah told us about a Machlokes Rebbe and Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda. Rebbe is very machmir. Rebbe says, Shimon, who poured the water into the kemach, he's over the Yisad Daraisa of Lush. As soon as he introduces the water into the kemach, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda said, nah, Rebbe, you're being much too machmir. You're not over the Yisad Daraisa of Lush until you actually do the kneading. You would jump in here from this Ramah, and you would say, what does the Ramah say? What's megablin? What is the taich of kneading? Nesinas mayim bekemach, putting water into kemach. Sounds like he's taking sides. He's paskening like Rebbe, right? Nesinas mayim bekemach, nikra gibel. Let's right away take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ice Cut Nun Aleph, Nesinas mayim. The Ramah says introducing the water does haste gibel. Says the Chavetz Chaim, hi lish lav dafka. Take it easy, calm down, have a seat. Don't make that diuk. The Mechaber Ayri Pai Belisha Gemura, the Mechaber over here is discussing 100% bona fide Lisha, Shenoisan Hamayim Umegabel. The Mechaber over here and the Ramah here in the parentheses, no. Ein Megabelin means you can't go ahead, introduce the water, and mix it. That's what it means. It doesn't mean simply introducing the water to Ramah is not coming here to paskin like Rebbe. So now that we got that out of the way, let's go back to the Mechaber. Ein megablin, you're not allowed to knead. Pirish desidas mayim bekemach nikra gibel. Introducing water into flour and kneading it is called gibel. And what is the Mechaber saying? Ein megablin. You're not allowed to knead kemach koli harbe. You are not allowed to knead a large quantity of flour made from toasted grain. Okay, why? Shema yavoi lalush kemach she'ena koli. Because you might come to actually do the malacha of lush using regular flour. So what do we see here? Okay, to knead regular flour, to go take water and add it to normal flour, that's lush 101. That's definitely an Issa Daraisa, right? Says the Mechaber, how about kneading kemach koli? How about adding water to flour made from toasted grain and kneading that? Are you allowed to do that? Says the Mechaber, you're not allowed to do it if you're doing a large quantity. But, continues the Mechaber, but you are allowed to add water to flour made from toasted grain, and you're allowed to need a small amount. So what's going on over here? What's going on over here is very simple. When you mix water with flour made from toasted grain, that is needing something that is not a true bar gibel. It's not a real bar gibel. Since it's not a real bar gibel, the Mechaber is paskening like the Rambam. The Rambam holds that when you need something which is not a bar gibel, it cannot be an Issa D'Oraisa. It can only be an Issa D'Rabbanan. Once we're dealing with an Issa D'Rabbanan, says the Mechaber, are you allowed to go do it on a large scale? No, it would be an Issa D'Rabbanan. But you could do ma'at. You could do a little bit at a time. Why could you do a little bit at a time? You could do a little bit at a time because doing a little bit at a time constitutes a major shinui. That's called, for whatever reason, apparently it wasn't the derech. When you do a small amount, that constitutes a major shinui, and since it's a major shinui, it becomes mutter. So again, kneading water with regular flour is a daraisa. Kneading flour made from toasted grain, kemach kalui, is a drabanan. Why is it only an issa drabanan? Because flour made from toasted grain is not a bar gibel. Why is it also at all? Why is it also a drabanan? Because it sure looks like lush, right? So it's an issa drabanan because we can't let you go ahead lechatchila and go ahead and make a lisha with flour made from toasted grain, because if we let you do that, you might come to do it with regular grain, but with regular flour. But we're going to let you do it in a small quantity, because small quantity, that already is a shinoi gomor, that's a major shinoi, and therefore, it's only an issa d'Rabbanan, we're going to allow you to do it. Okay, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton nun beis, shema yavoi. You're not allowed to do a large amount. To go create a large amount of dough made using flour made out of toasted grain, that you're not allowed to do. Why? Shema yavoi. Because if we let you do that, you might come to go need regular flour. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kol zeh hasif hu lashon Rambam. This is cut and paste from the Rambam. Usvirale, the Rambam holds, the kemach koli lav bar gibel hu. That flour made from toasted grain is not a bar gibel. It's not a true bar gibel. V'davar the lav bar gibel in a chayev af kishe. And to go need that is not an issa d'oraisa, because it's not a bar gibel. Ve'ena aser elam d'Rabbanan. It's only an issa d'Rabbanan. Why is it also d'Rabbanan? Shema yaveh lavosh kemach she'ena kali. Because if we let you need using flour made from toasted grain, you might come to need using regular flour that's not made from toasted grain. Ulafikach, and therefore, since we're only dealing with an issa d'Rabbanan, hitiru al yidei shinoi de ma'at ma'at, they were mata you to do this in small quantities, because that constitutes a major shinoi. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, you should know, afilu l'shar paiskim, even according to the paiskim, disviruhu dekamach kali bar gibelhu. Apparently, there's a machlokes hapaiskim. Some paiskim disagree with this mechaber here, and they hold that kemach kali, flour made from toasted grain, actually is a bar gibel. Now, if you would do the math, you would say, kemach kali is a bar gibel according to those paiskim, so it's an issa d'oraisa, right? Well, that's true. Afilu l'shar paiskim disfirlu de kemach kali bar gibel u'v'chayv min HaTorah kishegibloi. Even according to the paiskim that hold that kemach kali is a bar gibel. Okay, well, now that it's a bar gibel, so to do lush with it is an issa d'oraisa. Now, the next step in the math would be, if it's a bar gibel and it's an issa d'oraisa, are you allowed to do small quantities? Are you allowed to do ma'at ma'at? You would say no way. Are you allowed to take some regular King Arthur white bread flour and do lush in small quantities? No. That's lush 101. It's an issa d'oraisa. You can't do it even in tiny quantities. Chatzi shir aser min HaTorah. Even if there's a minimum share of kegregris, I think that's what the minimum share is, by lush, we'll see. But even to do half a gregris, chasi share also min HaTorah. So are you allowed to do small quantities? No. So if you're telling me that flour made from toasted grain is a bar gibel, so then kneading it is an issa daraisa, and then the next step in the math should be, I don't care how little you do, it's still an issa daraisa. Says the Mishnah Berurah, surprise, surprise, no. According to the poskim that hold that kemach koli is a bar gibel and it's an issa daraisa, but in small quantities, you're still allowed to do it. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Afilu l'shar poskim disfilu kemach koli bar gibelu v'chayim in HaTorah kishegibloi. Mikamokim, nevertheless, Gam heim moidu, they still agree that if you use this shinoi, what shinoi? Doing a very small quantity at a time, shari b'kamach koli, it's mutter by toasted grain. Now, he doesn't explain why. It seems that the explanation is that, again, it's a shinoi gomor. Usually a shinoi on an issa daraisa just turns it into an issa darabanan. But we've already seen this before. We saw this by Teichen. By Teichen, it's a daraisa. But you go ahead and you employ a double shinoi, you do it with the handle of a knife, and you do it on a plate, it's considered such a shinoi that it's not even an issa darabanan. It's mutar lagamri. We've seen it in other places so far as well. Here too, we have another example. For some reason, the poskim hold that even if kemach koli is mamish bar gibel, and doing losh on it is mamish and issa daraisa, but ma'at would be mutar, because somehow that is considered a major shinui. It's called a shinui lagamri, and now it's mamish mutar lagamri. Vadan, you should know, says the Mishnah Berurah, the lahayesh omer mamuva lekaman b'sif tezayin. According to a yesh omer that we're going to see later on in sif tezayin, in this Siman, gam be'inyan zeh also legaber lefila ma'at eli imkei nasan al kemach mayim mibo yom. We're going to see that there is a shita that disputes this. There's a shita that says that the only way you would be allowed to do this gibel is if you poured water into this kemach koli already on Erev Shabbos. We'll get there to sif tezayin. Okay, says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Nun Gimel. So the Mechaber told us that there's an Issa D'Rabbanan to do losh on Kemach Koli. But only if you're doing a harbe, if you're doing a large quantity. What's the Issa D'Rabbanan? If we let you do it on Kemach Koli, you might come to do it on Kemach She'ena Koli. You might come to do it on regular flour. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Nun Gimel, Kemach She'ena Koli. Feel about Mad Oser. That's Lush 101. That's Oser even if you do small quantities. Ois Katan Nun Dalid, Ma'at. You're allowed to do Kemach Koli a little bit at a time. V'loy Harbe, says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Nun Dalid. But not a lot, right? That's what the Mechaber said. The Mechaber said you have a heter to do Lush on Kemach Koli if you imply a shinui of doing ma'at, a little at a time. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'loy Harbe, but not a lot. Okay, continues the Mishnah Berurah. You should know, first of all, that the isser of doing harbe, the isser of doing a large quantity of kemach koli, it's aser beinam isa balila raka, whether you do a soft batter, like a pourable cake batter, or kasha, or you do a stiff dough, like a challah dough. V'shiur debat mat le'bira paiskim. What does a little at a time mean? Says the Mishnah Berurah, the paiskim don't tell us what a little at a time means. Venera, it would seem, says the Chavetz Chaim, you might be tempted to say, oh, I'll tell you what ma'at means. Well, the minimum shear that you have to do losh on in order to be over, in order to be chayiv v'kabachata, so you did a p'shoigeg, would be an amount equal to the size of a dried fig. So maybe that's the bar that we should use. Maybe we should say, you know what ma'at means? Ma'at means a little bit less than a gregaris. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, that's not what it means. V'shiur debat mat le'bira paiskim, and here it seems to me that afilu yesh by kisher gregaris, even if you're doing an amount that's already equal to a dried fig, that's still called ma'at. Vayin b'bir halacha d'Ramas Shema, where he discusses this in greater detail. The point over here is that when the Mechaber says you're allowed to do a little bit at a time, he's not referring to the minimum shear to be over an isser. Not the minimum share to be over an isser. Ma'at is a subjective term. Are you making a small amount of dough or are you making a large amount of dough? Says the Mishnah Berurah, a dough the size of a gregaris is definitely a small amount of dough. You come to the kitchen and your wife is kneading a little dough the size of a dried fig. No one's going to say, you already went past the share of a gregaris. I think you're doing harbe. I think that's called a lot. Really now? That's not a lot by any stretch of the imagination. So that's why the Mishnah Berurah says, Nira, I feel yesh by share gregaris, that could still be called a small amount. Now, the truth is that the Olam, for the most part, I would assume, is not going to see this share until tomorrow. I am recording this share on Monday, but this is Tuesday's share. I should have said something yesterday, but today, Monday, Gimel of, I have yard site for my father, Rabbi Aaron Tzvi ben Remeir. All of the Harbotzas HaTorah that's done by myself and my brothers, which Baruch Hashem equals to a serious amount of Harbotzas Torah, really all goes to it all comes from the efforts of my father and Yibadal L'chaim, my mother. My father encouraged us in Harbotzas HaTorah from the time that we were very, very young, and the learning that we do here in all of the shiurim should be a schus, le'ilui nishmasai. So if you're seeing this on Monday, please have in mind it should be a schus for Rabbi Aaron Tzvi ben Remeir, Olav Shalom. If you see it on Tuesday, it works on Tuesday as well. Rabbi Isai. Thank you so much for joining me for Limud HaTorah. The schus of Limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael, the Rebbeinu Shem should send Yeshua's refuahs, parnaset, sheduchim to those in need. We should be zoichet to see the bias kol tzedek b'mhera v'yameinu amen. Be well.